Hey guys, tonight we drift slowly over dark, open water, the kind that looks endless even when you know there's land somewhere far beyond the horizon. You imagine yourself leaning back, listening to the low, steady hush of waves sliding past a ship's hull, the ocean behaving in the most boring way possible, which is already a problem for the legend you've probably heard. This is the Bermuda Triangle, after all, the place where ships supposedly vanish, planes drop from the sky, and reality politely steps aside to let mystery take over. And yet, as you float here, nothing dramatic happens. No glowing lights, no sudden whirlpools, just water, sky, and time stretching out in front of you. You probably won't survive this, not because it's dangerous, but because it's so painfully ordinary it might put you to sleep before anything exciting can go wrong. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You remain right here, suspended in the present, as the story everyone thinks they know starts to soften around the edges. The Bermuda Triangle isn't a sharp point on a map. It doesn't announce itself. You don't cross a glowing boundary where instruments fail and doom politely knocks. Instead, you drift through a wide stretch of Atlantic Ocean that's been traveled for centuries. Merchant ships slide through these waters every single day. Cruise liners lumber along predictable routes. Cargo vessels, dull and practical, hum steadily onward without so much as a spooky creak. If something strange were truly happening here all the time, you'd expect a lot more paperwork. As you picture yourself standing on deck, the air is warm and faintly salty. The sky is clear enough to see stars beginning to blink awake. This is the moment where myths usually lean in close and whisper that you're in danger, but reality yawns instead. The ocean has always had a talent for feeling larger than life, and humans have always had a talent for filling empty spaces with stories. Long before anyone used the phrase Bermuda Triangle, sailors swapped uneasy tales about compasses acting funny or storms appearing out of nowhere. The sea was unpredictable, navigation was imprecise, and fear had plenty of room to stretch its legs. A mainstream historical fact quietly hums beneath all of this. The Atlantic shipping routes near Bermuda, Florida, and Puerto Rico are some of the busiest in the world. They've been busy since the age of sail, and they only got busier once steam engines and modern trade took over. More traffic naturally meant more accidents, especially back when charts were rough guesses and communication traveled no faster than the wind. But instead of chalking mishaps up to weather, human error, or plain bad luck, people reached for something more dramatic. It's easier to blame a curse than admit you misread the stars. You slowly realize that the calm you're imagining right now is exactly what makes the myth feel believable. A quiet ocean invites your mind to wander. When nothing obvious happens, every creak of the ship sounds important. Every cloud feels suspicious. A quirky tidbit slips in here, almost unnoticed. Many early triangle disappearances were reported months or even years after the fact, sometimes with incorrect dates, wrong locations, or ships that were later discovered safe and sound. By the time the stories reached the public, they'd already been smoothed into something far more mysterious than the original events. You let your shoulders drop as the water keeps rolling beneath you. The present tense stretches on. This is not a horror movie jump scare. It's a slow, lulling realization that boredom itself is the real threat. Historians still argue whether the Bermuda Triangle myth was ever meant to be taken seriously, or if it started as a kind of sensational shorthand, a way to bundle scattered maritime incidents into one easily marketable story. Either way, once the idea existed, it fed on itself. Each retelling added a little polish, a little suspense, and shaved away the dull explanations that made the truth harder to sell. As you remain here, breathing evenly, the triangle itself starts to feel less like a place and more like a mood, a suggestion, a story that floats just above the water, refusing to sink even when evidence piles up on top of it. The sea doesn't care about your expectations. It doesn't know it's supposed to be mysterious tonight. It just keeps moving, wave after wave, doing what it has always done. You can almost feel the myth thinning, like fog warming under early sunlight. You're still at the beginning, still drifting, and nothing has gone wrong yet. No alarms, no panicked voices, just the gentle certainty that the legend you've been promised may not deliver on its threats. And as the ship carries you forward, unbothered and steady, you start to sense where this journey is heading. Not toward danger, but toward the slow, satisfying unraveling of a mystery that was never quite as mysterious as it claimed to be. You keep drifting forward, still standing in the same gentle present when the story quietly rewinds itself. Not centuries back, not to ancient sailors whispering curses, but to a surprisingly recent moment in history. This is where the Bermuda Triangle really begins, and it's far less dramatic than you were led to believe. The ocean doesn't change. The stars don't rearrange themselves. What changes is the way people start talking. It's the mid-20th century, and you imagine yourself sitting comfortably on land for once, flipping through newspapers and popular magazines. The world has just come through massive wars. Aviation is booming, and the idea of modern technology failing feels both terrifying and fascinating. Ships and planes are supposed to be reliable now, so when something goes wrong, it feels unnatural. That discomfort creates a perfect opening for a story that promises mystery instead of mundane explanations. The phrase Bermuda Triangle hasn't even been coined yet. What exists instead are scattered articles mentioning strange losses at sea, often written with a raised eyebrow and a flair for the dramatic. One writer mentions a ship that vanished. Another brings up a plane that never arrived. They aren't lying exactly, but they're not being careful either. Dates slip, locations blur, context evaporates. You can almost feel the editorial pressure to make things sound exciting enough to sell. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. In 1950, an Associated Press article casually noted a few unexplained ship losses near Florida and the Caribbean. It wasn't meant to launch a legend. It was filler, a curiosity piece. But once the idea was printed, that something odd might be happening in that stretch of ocean, it lodged itself firmly in the public imagination. From there, it didn't need much encouragement. You imagine the next writers picking up the thread, stretching it gently at first. They start grouping incidents together that happened decades apart. Different ships, different conditions, different causes, now sitting side by side as if they're related. A missing cargo ship from the 1800s suddenly shares a page with a military training flight from the 1940s. The ocean between them collapses into a single spooky zone. The gaps are quietly ignored. Here's a quirky tidbit that rarely makes it into dramatic retellings. Some early Bermuda Triangle books openly admitted they were speculating, but later authors cited those speculations as confirmed facts. A guess became a claim. A claim became common knowledge. By the time you're hearing about it, the original uncertainty has been completely sanded away. What remains is a smooth, confident story that sounds authoritative simply because it's been repeated so often. You can feel the tone shift as the legend gains momentum. Headlines grow bolder. Words like mysterious and unexplained appear more frequently, even when explanations already exist in shipping logs or accident reports. Planes that ran out of fuel are described as vanishing without a trace. Ships that sank in storms are labeled lost under clear skies. You don't need to invent new events, just reinterpret the old ones through a more exciting lens. As you mentally leaf through these books and articles, you notice something else happening. Maps start appearing, each one slightly different. One draws a neat triangle between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. Another stretches it wider, scooping up extra disappearances like a fisherman widening his net. The shape becomes flexible, convenient. Wherever something odd happened, the triangle somehow managed to include it. That alone should make you sleepy with skepticism. Historians still argue whether the authors who popularized the Bermuda Triangle genuinely believed in it, or simply recognized a good story when they saw one. Some insist there was sincere curiosity at the beginning, a real attempt to understand patterns. Others point out that book sales skyrocketed once aliens, time warps, and ancient civilizations entered the narrative. Either way, once money and attention entered the picture, boring explanations were no longer enough. You remain calm as this realization settles in. The myth didn't emerge from the depths of the ocean. It emerged from desks, typewriters, and publishing deadlines. Each retelling added confidence, not evidence. And the more confident the story sounded, the less anyone felt the need to double-check the original sources. After all, someone else surely already had. There's a subtle comfort in this stage of the journey. You're not facing an unknowable force. You're watching human behavior play out in slow motion. Fear plus imagination plus repetition equals legend. It's the same recipe used everywhere else in history, just poured over salt water instead of ancient ruins or dark forests. The triangle feels special only because it has good branding. As the ocean continues its steady rhythm beneath you, the timeline finishes looping back to the present. You now understand that the mystery didn't start with a sudden spike in accidents. It started with storytelling momentum. The sea didn't change. Navigation didn't suddenly fail. People simply began connecting dots that were never meant to form a picture in the first place. You drift onward, heavier with context but lighter with fear. The triangle is already losing its sharp edges, turning softer, more manageable. And as the night deepens, you sense that every layer peeled back from this myth makes the ocean feel quieter, safer, and perhaps most dangerously for staying awake. Very, very boring. You keep moving forward, carried not by waves now, but by lines on paper. Maps that look authoritative at first glance, clean and confident, like they know exactly what they're talking about. You picture yourself leaning over one of them, tracing a finger along sharp angles that form a tidy triangle in the Atlantic. It feels official, mathematical, comfortingly precise. And yet, the longer you stare, the more the edges begin to blur. This is where the legend quietly cheats. The Bermuda Triangle, as you've probably seen it, doesn't have a fixed size. Sometimes it's drawn small and neat, connecting Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico like a child's geometry exercise. Other times it balloons outward, swallowing huge stretches of ocean, drifting closer to the Azores, brushing the Gulf of Mexico, even nudging parts of the eastern United States. You don't notice this inconsistency right away because the story keeps your attention focused on disappearances, not definitions. A mainstream historical fact anchors this uncomfortable truth. There is no official recognition of the Bermuda Triangle by maritime authorities, international shipping organizations, or naval charts. You won't find it labeled on maps used by commercial pilots or ship captains. Insurance companies don't mark it as a risk zone. Coast guards don't issue special warnings when you cross into it. From an operational standpoint, it simply doesn't exist. You imagine a sailor unfolding a real navigation chart, the kind smudged with use and salt. There's no dramatic shading, no ominous label, just depth measurements, currents, coastlines, and routes that have been calculated and recalculated for generations. If the triangle were genuinely dangerous in some unique way, this is where it would show up. Instead, it remains a ghost, visible only in books that want it to be there. Here's a quirky tidbit that slips in almost unnoticed. Some disappearances credited to the Bermuda Triangle didn't even happen within its supposed boundaries at the time they occurred. Later writers simply redrew the triangle to include them. The map moved to fit the mystery, not the other way around. It's a quiet sleight of hand, and once you see it, it's hard to unsee. You feel the calm irony of it all settle in. The more flexible the borders become, the more powerful the legend feels. Any accident at sea can be pulled into the narrative with a gentle nudge of the pencil. Storm off the Carolinas, close enough. Mechanical failure near the Bahamas, that'll do. A ship lost far out in the Atlantic, stretch the line. No one checks too closely because the shape itself feels convincing. Historians still argue whether this shifting geography was intentional manipulation or simply sloppy storytelling passed down without scrutiny. Some believe early authors didn't realize how much they were bending the map. Others suspect they knew exactly what they were doing, quietly expanding the triangle whenever a good story needed a home. Either way, the result is the same, a mystery that grows not through evidence, but through elastic boundaries. You linger on the idea of borders for a moment, letting it slow your breathing. Humans love lines. We trust them. They make the world feel organized and safe, but the ocean doesn't respect them. Currents don't stop at triangles. Storms don't check coordinates before forming. By forcing a geometric shape onto something as fluid as the sea, the legend creates an illusion of control, while quietly hiding the fact that nothing meaningful separates this area from any other busy stretch of ocean. As you drift onward, the triangle starts to feel less like a place and more like a storytelling convenience. It exists wherever someone needs it to exist. Its borders expand in moments of excitement and shrink when scrutiny appears. That alone should make you yawn with relief. Real dangers don't behave like that. They're consistent. They leave patterns that don't need artistic interpretation. You picture yourself folding the map away, the lines creasing softly as it disappears. Without it, the ocean returns to being just ocean, wide, repetitive, and honest in its indifference. The fear that once clung to those sharp angles has nowhere to anchor itself now. It drifts off, unclaimed. And as the night deepens and the story continues, you realize something soothing. Once the borders dissolve, the mystery has very little left to stand on. What remains isn't a cursed zone or a hungry sea. It's simply a reminder that when you draw a shape around randomness, it can look meaningful for a while. Eventually, though, the pencil lines fade and boredom gently takes their place. You continue drifting, and now the map fades completely, replaced by sky. This is the part of the story where storms usually make their entrance, where clouds roll in on cue and the ocean supposedly reveals its temper. You imagine standing on deck again, feeling a shift in the air, not ominous, just normal. Warmer currents rise, cooler winds slide over them, and the atmosphere does what it has always done. Weather happens. The Atlantic in this region is a crossroads of powerful systems. Warm tropical air drifts north from the equator, meeting cooler fronts sliding down from higher latitudes. Add in the Gulf Stream, fast, warm, and energetic, and you get a recipe for sudden changes. A clear afternoon can turn into a choppy night with very little warning. There's nothing supernatural about it, but there is something inconvenient, especially if you're navigating with limited instruments or tired eyes. A mainstream historical fact grounds this realization. Before modern satellites and forecasting, sailors and pilots relied on barometers, cloud shapes, and experience to predict weather. Those tools were helpful but far from perfect. Sudden squalls and fast-forming storms were common, and when they caught ships or planes off guard, the results could be catastrophic. Later retellings often stripped away these conditions, leaving behind the illusion of calm seas and clear skies. Perfect soil for mystery to grow. You feel the rhythm of the wind now, steady but alive. The ocean doesn't need to swallow ships whole to be dangerous. It just needs time and persistence. Rogue waves, for example, were once dismissed as sailor superstition. Walls of water rising unexpectedly, smashing into vessels that thought they were safe. Today, we know they're real, formed by the stacking of wave energy under specific conditions. But for centuries, survivors struggled to explain them. A ship damaged by a single, towering wave sounded unbelievable, so people reached for stranger explanations. Here's a quirky tidbit that slips in softly. Some storms blamed on the Bermuda Triangle were later identified as hurricanes that had already been named and tracked, but whose records weren't widely accessible to the public at the time. Without that information, disappearances seemed sudden and inexplicable. With it, they become tragic but ordinary entries in meteorological history. You let this sink in as the night air cools. The triangle's reputation leans heavily on the idea of unpredictability, but unpredictability is simply how weather felt before we learned to see it from above. Satellites didn't exist. Radar was limited. A ship could sail directly into danger without realizing it until the waves were already climbing the deck. When no distress call followed, the silence felt eerie. In reality, it was just fast-moving water and faster-moving wind. Historians still argue whether weather alone can explain every single disappearance attributed to the Bermuda Triangle. Some cases remain murky, not because of cosmic forces, but because records are incomplete or lost. Logbooks sank. Radio transmissions were missed. Eyewitness accounts conflicted. The gaps feel unsettling, but gaps are not evidence of the impossible. They're evidence of the ocean's ability to erase details. You notice how gentle this explanation feels compared to the myth. There's no lurking intelligence, no intent. Storms don't hunt. Waves don't choose victims. They respond to pressure, temperature, and physics, the same way they always have. Once you accept that, the fear loses its teeth. The triangle stops feeling like a trap and starts feeling like a place where nature is simply doing its job, uninterrupted. As you drift onward, the wind settles into a steady sigh, almost like breathing. The sea rolls, indifferent and unbothered. What once sounded like chaos now resembles routine. The mystery doesn't explode, it dissolves. And with every mile you imagine passing, the idea of cursed weather grows quieter, replaced by something far less exciting and far more comforting. The calm certainty that storms don't need legends to explain them. You keep drifting forward, and now your attention settles on something small and quietly unsettling, a compass needle. You imagine it resting under glass, floating in its little pool of liquid, trembling just enough to make you uneasy. This is where many Bermuda Triangle stories slow their voices and lower the lights, hinting that navigation itself betrays you here. The needle spins, directions lose meaning. North becomes a suggestion instead of a fact. It sounds terrifying until you let yourself stay with it long enough to understand what's really going on. The Earth itself is the main character now. You're moving across a planet wrapped in an invisible magnetic field, a field that isn't perfectly aligned with geographic north. There's true north, the axis the planet spins on, and magnetic north, the wandering point your compass actually points toward. The difference between them is called magnetic declination, and it changes depending on where you are and when you are. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Magnetic declination varies across the globe and shifts slowly over time. Navigators have accounted for it for centuries by adjusting their readings. In some places, including parts of the Atlantic, that difference is small. In others, it's noticeable enough to matter if you don't correct for it. None of this is secret. It's printed right on navigation charts. You imagine yourself as a pilot or sailor who isn't paying close attention. Maybe you're tired. Maybe the weather's turning. Maybe you assume your compass points to true north because no one explained the difference clearly enough. A few degrees off doesn't feel like much at first, but over hours of travel, that small error stretches into miles. Suddenly, you're not where you think you are. Land doesn't appear when expected. Fuel runs low. Panic creeps in quietly, then all at once. Here's a quirky tidbit that often gets exaggerated into something mystical. There are rare places where magnetic north and true north line up perfectly, called agonic lines. At certain points in history, one of these lines passed through parts of the Atlantic. Some writers turned this into evidence that compasses malfunction in the Bermuda Triangle. In reality, it means the compass was behaving normally, just without the usual correction needed. Confusion came from expectation, not malfunction. You feel the myth unravel a little more. Compasses don't spin wildly or stop working here. They do exactly what they're designed to do. The problem arises when humans misunderstand them. Early navigation was a careful dance of math, observation, and experience. Miss one step, and the whole routine fell apart. Later retellings skipped that nuance, replacing it with the idea that the ocean itself was interfering. Historians still argue whether compass confusion played a major role in famous triangle incidents, or if it's been overstated to add drama. Some cases clearly involve navigational errors compounded by stress and weather. Others mention compasses only in hindsight, once the story had already grown strange. Either way, there's no evidence of a unique magnetic anomaly haunting this region. You picture the compass needle settling now, pointing calmly, patiently. It has no agenda. It isn't trying to deceive you. It responds to physics, not legends. The anxiety came from not knowing how to read it properly, from trusting a simple instrument without understanding its limitations. That realization feels grounding, almost soothing. As the ship continues its steady path, the idea of magnetic betrayal loses its power. Navigation becomes human again, imperfect, vulnerable, but understandable. When things went wrong, it wasn't because north vanished. It was because people, tired and under pressure, made small mistakes that added up over time. You drift onward, breathing evenly, as the compass fades from view. The triangle's grip loosens further. What once sounded like an invisible force twisting reality now feels like a lesson in humility and preparation. And in the quiet that follows, there's something deeply calming about knowing that even the scariest explanations can often be traced back to something as simple as a misunderstood needle, pointing faithfully and waiting for someone to listen. You keep drifting, and now the stories grow quieter, heavier, weighted with the word everyone loves to repeat: vanished. Ships that supposedly slip beneath the waves without a sound, leaving no wreckage, no survivors, no explanation. You picture an empty horizon, a ship expected but never seen again, and it feels unsettling in that slow, bedtime story way. But as you stay with the idea, letting it breathe, the word vanished starts to lose its magic. Ships don't actually disappear very well. A mainstream historical fact settles in gently. Maritime losses have always been meticulously recorded. Shipping manifests, port departure logs, insurance paperwork, boring, relentless documentation followed ships everywhere. When a vessel failed to arrive, people noticed. Investigations followed. And in many of the Bermuda Triangle's most famous cases, those investigations eventually found answers that just didn't make for exciting reading. You imagine leafing through old records now, the kind that smell faintly of dust and ink. One so-called vanished ship turns out to have been caught in a documented storm. Another was later found wrecked far from where legend claimed it disappeared. Some were misreported entirely. Wrong ship names, wrong years, wrong locations. But once the dramatic version entered popular books, the corrections rarely caught up. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost sleepy in its irony. Several ships listed as lost in the Bermuda Triangle were later discovered to have never sunk at all. They were renamed, sold, or quietly retired, their supposed disappearance living on only in mystery paperbacks. Reality kept moving, while the legend stayed frozen in place. You notice how the stories tend to skip over the unglamorous middle parts. Ships were often old, maintenance was expensive, crews were small and overworked, engines failed, hulls weakened. When something went wrong far from shore, especially before modern radio communication, there was often no dramatic final message, just silence. Later generations interpreted that silence as something unnatural, when it was really just distance doing its job. Historians still argue whether some losses were exaggerated intentionally or if errors simply compounded over time. One author copies another, who copied someone else before them. Each retelling smooths over uncertainty and sharpens mystery. By the time you hear the story, the original footnotes, full of maybes and possibilities, are long gone. You imagine standing on deck again, watching the water slide past. The ocean is very good at hiding things. Wrecks sink deep, currents scatter debris, wood rots, metal corrodes. The absence of remains feels eerie, but it's also completely expected. This isn't a stage designed for evidence to linger. It's a place where time erases details with steady patience. As this realization settles, the fear attached to vanishing begins to soften. The ships didn't step through portals. They didn't blink out of existence. They failed, slowly or suddenly, in a place where failure is hard to witness and harder to reconstruct. The mystery survives mainly because the ocean refuses to keep receipts. You drift onward, the word vanished, losing weight with every passing moment. It turns out to be shorthand, not proof. A convenient label slapped onto events that were messy, tragic, and ultimately human. And as the night grows quieter, there's something oddly comforting about that. The sea didn't steal these ships for reasons beyond understanding. It simply did what it has always done, kept its secrets through depth, distance, and time. You keep drifting forward, and now the focus lifts gently from the water into the air. The ocean below is still calm, still repetitive, but above you stretches an open sky where another set of Bermuda Triangle stories likes to unfold. This is where planes enter the legend. Small training aircraft, passenger flights, confident pilots who supposedly vanished mid-sentence. You imagine yourself seated in a cockpit, the steady hum of engines blending with your own slow breathing, everything feeling routine right up until it doesn't. Flying, especially in the early and mid-20th century, demanded constant attention. Instruments were fewer. Navigation relied heavily on visual landmarks, radio beacons, and dead reckoning, estimating your position based on speed, direction, and time. It worked well when conditions were good. When they weren't, tiny errors piled up quietly. A few degrees off course, a misread fuel gauge, a misunderstood radio instruction. None of it dramatic on its own, but together it could turn serious. A mainstream historical fact settles in here. Aviation accident investigations repeatedly show that human error plays a role in the majority of crashes. Fatigue, stress, poor weather decisions, and miscommunication are far more dangerous than mysterious forces. This was even more true decades ago, when pilot training standards varied widely and backup systems were limited. Flying over open water left little room for correction once something went wrong. You imagine a pilot scanning the horizon, looking for landmarks that simply aren't there. Water looks the same in every direction, especially under cloud cover or fading light. Depth perception falters. The horizon blurs. It's easy to feel level while slowly descending, easy to think you're climbing when you're not. This phenomenon, spatial disorientation, has claimed countless aircraft, not just in the Bermuda Triangle, but everywhere pilots lose visual reference. Here's a quirky tidbit that often gets overlooked. Some pilots involved in famous triangle stories were relatively inexperienced with long overwater flights. Training exercises pushed them into unfamiliar conditions, sometimes late in the day, sometimes with minimal fuel reserves. Later accounts painted them as seasoned professionals undone by mystery, but records suggest something far more ordinary: learning curves meeting unforgiving environments. Historians still argue whether aviation losses in this region were truly unusual for their time. Some researchers point out that the number of incidents aligns closely with traffic volume. More flights mean more opportunities for mistakes to happen. Others debate how well early investigations captured all the contributing factors. Either way, none of the debates require anything supernatural to make sense of the outcomes. You feel the tension ease as the sky becomes just sky again. Engines don't fail because they crossed an invisible line. Pilots don't lose their skills because of a curse. When accidents happened, they followed patterns seen all over the world, patterns tied to weather, training, fatigue, and judgment. The difference here was the storytelling afterward, the way silence over open water invited imagination to step in. As you drift onward, the cockpit fades, replaced by the same gentle darkness you started with. The air feels calmer now, less charged with expectation. The idea of planes vanishing midair loses its grip, replaced by something quieter and more honest. The understanding that early aviation was brave, imperfect, and sometimes tragic, especially when humans asked it to do more than it safely could. The triangle continues to soften, its sharp edges rounding off into something almost mundane. And as the steady hum returns, whether of engines or waves, it's hard to tell. You settle deeper into the realization that mystery thrives most where information is thin and mistakes are human. Everything else is just altitude and imagination. 19. Even if you've never gone looking for Bermuda Triangle lore, this one probably found you anyway. You imagine 5 training aircraft lifting off together, engines humming in loose formation, the sky wide and forgiving. Nothing about the moment feels cursed. It feels instructional, routine, almost boring, which is exactly why the story later becomes so powerful. It's December 1945. You picture yourself in one of those cockpits, part of a naval training exercise designed to teach navigation, not test fate. The plan is simple: fly out, practice bombing runs, turn, and come home. But as the afternoon wears on, confusion creeps in. Landmarks don't match expectations. The ocean stretches on, uniform and unhelpful. Voices over the radio grow uncertain, clipped, strained. A mainstream historical fact grounds this moment. Flight 19's lead instructor, Charles Taylor, had a documented history of getting lost during previous flights. He wasn't incompetent, but he was known to struggle with navigation under pressure. That detail often disappears in dramatic retellings, replaced by the image of an experienced pilot undone by forces beyond comprehension. You imagine the confusion building. Taylor believes the compasses are malfunctioning. He suspects they're over the Florida Keys when they're likely east over the Atlantic. Acting on that assumption, the group follows his lead, flying farther from safety instead of toward it. The decision isn't irrational. It's a reasonable response to bad information, layered on top of stress and fading daylight. Here's a quirky tidbit that rarely makes it into spooky documentaries. Radio transcripts from Flight 19 suggest disagreement among the pilots. Some believed they were heading the wrong way and wanted to turn back. But in military training flights, the lead instructor's decisions carry weight. Doubt doesn't automatically become action, especially when fuel is burning with every minute of debate. Historians still argue whether mechanical issues played any role at all, or if the incident was purely navigational error compounded by weather. What isn't seriously debated anymore is the need for supernatural explanations. Weather reports show deteriorating conditions. Fuel limitations explain the sudden silence. The absence of wreckage is tragic but expected. 5 small planes sinking into deep ocean leave very little behind. You let the aftermath settle in. A rescue plane sent to search for Flight 19 also failed to return, often cited as proof of something unnatural. But that aircraft, a PBM Mariner, had a known reputation for fuel vapor explosions. Witnesses reported seeing a fireball in the sky around the time it vanished. That detail, too, tends to get buried under layers of mystery. As you remain in the present, the story loses its sharpness. Flight 19 becomes less a supernatural puzzle and more a cautionary tale about training, hierarchy, and decision-making under stress. It's unsettling, yes, but in a human way. The kind of unsettling that reminds you how thin the margin for error once was, especially over open water. The triangle doesn't need to intervene here. No portals open. No forces interfere. Just a series of small, understandable choices stacking up until there's no easy way back. And as the engines fade in your imagination, replaced once again by the low hush of waves, you feel the weight of the legend lift slightly. Flight 19 wasn't swallowed by mystery. It was lost to confusion, weather, and time. Quiet, tragic factors that don't thrill the imagination, but explain far more than the myth ever could. You keep drifting forward, and the story takes an unexpectedly dull turn, toward paperwork, policies, and people who hate risk more than they love mystery. Insurance companies enter the scene, and the mood shifts immediately. You imagine quiet offices far from the ocean, desks stacked with forms, calculators clicking softly. These are not people who gamble on curses. These are people who lose money when things go wrong, and they care very deeply about patterns. A mainstream historical fact settles in here with a heavy yawn. Major maritime and aviation insurance companies have never classified the Bermuda Triangle as a high-risk or abnormal zone. Premiums do spike when ships sail through it. Policies don't include special clauses. Routes aren't rerouted to avoid it. If insurers, whose entire business model depends on predicting danger, don't see a problem, that should tell you something. You imagine an underwriter reviewing decades of loss data. Accidents are logged, categorized, compared. Weather-related losses here look similar to losses elsewhere in the Atlantic. Mechanical failures follow familiar distributions. Human error appears again and again, quietly consistent. Nothing in the numbers suggests a hungry patch of ocean behaving differently from the rest. If anything, the sheer volume of traffic passing through makes incidents feel more visible, not more frequent. Here's a quirky tidbit that rarely gets mentioned in dramatic specials. Lloyd's of London, one of the oldest and most influential insurance markets in the world, has repeatedly stated that it does not recognize the Bermuda Triangle as a real hazard. That's about as close as you can get to a professional shrug. If mystery were measurable, they would have monetized it by now. You let that sink in slowly. Insurance companies don't dismiss danger lightly. They obsess over it, they map it, they price it. Hurricanes get models. Piracy zones get warnings. War regions get exclusions. The Bermuda Triangle gets nothing. Just another stretch of ocean where things occasionally go wrong in predictable, deeply boring ways. Historians still argue whether public fascination pressured insurers to quietly double-check their data during the height of triangle hysteria in the 1960s and 70s. Some suggest internal reviews were conducted simply to reassure clients. If so, those reviews didn't change policy. The numbers didn't budge. The mystery failed the spreadsheet test. You imagine yourself watching ships pass through this region now, massive cargo vessels stacked with containers, cruise ships glowing softly at night. They don't slow down. They don't detour. Captains don't announce that you're entering a cursed zone. Operations manuals stay exactly the same. The triangle exists only in stories told after the fact, never in plans made beforehand. As the night deepens, there's something oddly comforting about this realization. Fear dissolves when it meets accounting. Legends lose their teeth when faced with actuarial tables. The ocean may be vast and indifferent, but it isn't selectively malicious. If it were, the people who insure it would have noticed long ago. You drift onward, lulled by the idea that mystery can't survive contact with risk assessment. The triangle grows quieter still, reduced now to a footnote that never made it into the policy manual. And in that silence, surrounded by nothing more exciting than probabilities and averages, sleep feels a little closer, a little heavier, and much harder for myths to interrupt. You keep drifting, and now the ocean feels crowded in the most unromantic way possible. Not with monsters or lost civilizations, but with traffic. Routes crisscross invisibly beneath you, the modern equivalent of highways, busy and relentlessly practical. This is the part of the story that usually gets skipped because it ruins the mood. The Bermuda Triangle sits right in the middle of some of the most heavily traveled shipping and flight corridors on Earth. A mainstream historical fact settles in gently. The waters between the southeastern United States, the Caribbean, and Central America have been major trade routes since the age of sail. Spanish treasure fleets, British merchant ships, American cargo vessels, all pass through here in enormous numbers. Today, that traffic has only increased, with container ships, tankers, cruise liners, and non-stop commercial flights moving through day and night. You imagine watching this from above, lights sliding across dark water like slow-moving constellations. When you have that much activity, accidents become statistically inevitable. It's not a sign of mystery, it's basic probability. If 1 out of every 1,000 journeys ends badly, you'll see more incidents in busy areas than in empty ones. The legend flips this logic around, treating frequency as proof of danger rather than evidence of volume. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost too boring to be true. Some years pass with no unusual incidents at all in the so-called triangle, while other regions of the world quietly experience far worse accident rates without attracting any mythology. Places with less publicity but harsher conditions rack up tragedies without ever becoming famous. You notice how storytelling trims away context. A ship lost here sounds sinister. 10 ships safely completing the same route that day don't make headlines. Planes land uneventfully by the hundreds and no one notices. The narrative only zooms in when something goes wrong, then acts as if the surrounding routine never existed. Historians still argue whether the triangle's reputation is a classic case of selection bias, where people notice and remember events that fit the story and ignore the rest. The more you hear about disappearances here, the more you expect them, and expectation sharpens attention. Meanwhile, accidents elsewhere fade into the background noise of global travel. You let this realization settle like a slow exhale. The triangle doesn't stand out because it's dangerous. It stands out because it's busy. Highways have more crashes than empty roads. Airports with more flights have more delays. The ocean follows the same rules, even when we'd rather believe it doesn't. As the ship carries you onward, the water feels less lonely now. Invisible companions pass nearby, each on their own dull, scheduled journey. The myth loses more of its power in this crowd. It thrives on isolation, on the idea of being alone with the unknown. But here, there is no alone, just traffic, timetables, and endless movement. The night deepens and the steady flow becomes hypnotic. Lights pass, then fade. Engines hum, then disappear into distance. Nothing dramatic happens, and that's the point. The Bermuda Triangle, stripped of silence and emptiness, becomes just another busy stretch of ocean. Too practical, too populated, and far too ordinary to support the weight of a supernatural legend. You keep drifting, and just when the story seems fully grounded in charts, numbers, and traffic lanes, something ancient and shiny tries to slip back in Atlantis. This is where the Bermuda Triangle legend stretches backward in time, reaching for lost civilizations, advanced technologies, and secrets buried beneath miles of water. You imagine the ocean floor glowing faintly, ruins humming with forgotten power. It's a tempting image, especially when reality has become so relentlessly sensible. Atlantis didn't start here, of course. Plato introduced it as a philosophical thought experiment, a cautionary tale about hubris and collapse. But over time, it escaped its original purpose and became a kind of narrative wildcard. Whenever something unexplained happens near water, Atlantis gets invited to the conversation, even if it has absolutely no reason to be there. A mainstream historical fact gently dissolves the fantasy. There is no archaeological evidence of an advanced, lost civilization beneath the Atlantic Ocean, let alone one centered in the Bermuda Triangle. Extensive ocean floor mapping, underwater surveys, and geological studies have found exactly what you'd expect: tectonic features, sediment layers, and the slow, unromantic work of plate movement. No crystal power sources, no sunken cities waiting to be rediscovered. You imagine how Atlantis got dragged into this anyway. Early triangle writers needed something old to give their mystery weight. Ancient equals important. Important feels credible. So vague references to Plato were stitched together with modern disappearances, as if centuries of silence could be skipped over without explanation. The time gap didn't matter, the vibe did. Here's a quirky tidbit that slips in softly. Some rock formations near Bimini, often cited as proof of Atlantis, have been studied extensively and are widely understood to be natural limestone formations shaped by erosion and fracturing. They look geometric enough to spark imagination, but nature is very good at accidentally imitating architecture. You feel the pattern repeating itself. When mystery thins, mythology rushes in to fill the space. Aliens get mentioned next, time warps, energy crystals, anything that adds sparkle without requiring evidence. Each addition moves the story further from the original events, but also makes it harder to let go. Once a mystery becomes cosmic, admitting its ordinary feels almost disappointing. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of Atlantis and similar ideas was meant to be metaphorical or was genuinely believed by some proponents. There's debate over how much was playful speculation versus sincere conviction. But there's little debate over the result. It muddied the waters so thoroughly that separating fiction from fact became exhausting for anyone trying. You remain calm as the glow fades from the imagined ruins. The ocean floor returns to darkness, quiet and indifferent. The appeal of ancient secrets gives way to something more grounded. The triangle doesn't need a lost civilization to explain it. Adding one only distracts from the very human processes that created the legend in the first place. As the night deepens, Atlantis sinks back where it belongs, not beneath the waves, but into the realm of metaphor and storytelling. The triangle grows quieter again, less crowded with imaginary ruins. What's left is a wide, empty seafloor and a sense of relief that some mysteries only survive by borrowing drama from places they were never meant to inhabit. You keep drifting, and now the story turns inward, away from the ocean, and toward the way information itself moves. This is where the Bermuda Triangle becomes less about water and more about feedback, stories echoing off one another until they sound like proof. You imagine a single idea dropped into a quiet room, bouncing wall to wall, growing louder with every reflection. Once a few popular books and TV specials caught on, the triangle stopped needing new evidence. Old cases were recycled, retold with sharper language and darker music. Each retelling cited the last, creating a loop that felt authoritative simply because it was familiar. Hearing the same thing again and again can make it feel true, even when nothing new has been added. A mainstream historical fact anchors this realization. During the 1960s and 70s, mass-market paperbacks and television documentaries dramatically shaped public understanding of unexplained phenomena. Sensational topics sold well, and the Bermuda Triangle fit perfectly into that ecosystem. Editing choices, ominous narration, and selective facts did most of the heavy lifting. You imagine watching one of those specials late at night, the kind that pauses just long enough to let your imagination fill the silence. Missing context is framed as mystery. Uncertainty is framed as evidence. The absence of answers becomes the answer itself. It's effective, especially when you don't have easy access to primary sources to double-check what you're hearing. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost too modern. Some triangle claims can be traced back to a single misquoted sentence that was repeated across multiple books, each citing the other as confirmation. The original context vanished, leaving behind a free-floating fact with no anchor. Historians still argue whether this feedback loop was an accident of media culture or a deliberate strategy to sustain interest. Some creators likely believed the stories they told. Others understood exactly how suspense works. Either way, repetition did what evidence could not. It cemented the myth into popular consciousness. You notice how comforting this process can be. A closed loop feels complete. It doesn't ask you to question. It invites you to relax into the story and accept that the mystery is real because everyone seems to agree that it is. Breaking that loop requires effort, and effort is not what bedtime stories usually demand. As you drift onward, the echoes begin to fade. You imagine turning the volume down, letting the room grow quiet again. Without the constant repetition, the triangle's voice weakens. It no longer sounds like a chorus. It sounds like a handful of familiar anecdotes replayed too many times. The ocean below remains unchanged, patient, and silent. The myth doesn't live there. It lives in the way stories are shared, trimmed, and amplified. Once you see that, the mystery loses its hypnotic rhythm. It can't keep looping forever if you stop feeding it attention. The night grows softer now. The feedback dissolves into stillness. And in that stillness, the Bermuda Triangle feels less like an unsolved riddle and more like a case study in how easily repetition can turn speculation into certainty, especially when the lights are low and the mind is ready to drift. You keep drifting, slower now, as the story reaches a calmer, more reflective stretch. Most of the noise has fallen away, leaving behind a few loose threads, small disagreements that still hum quietly beneath the surface. This is the part where historians pause, not because they believe in the mystery, but because history rarely ties everything up with a perfect bow. Even when a legend collapses, questions can linger. A mainstream historical fact grounds this moment. Historical analysis depends on surviving records, and maritime history is full of gaps. Logs were lost, radios failed, eyewitnesses contradicted one another. In some cases, investigators were forced to work with fragments. That uncertainty leaves room for debate, not about supernatural causes, but about specific chains of events. You imagine historians sitting with the same files, arriving at slightly different conclusions. Did a particular ship encounter worse weather than reported? Did a crew underestimate fuel consumption? Was an engine already compromised before departure? These are narrow, technical arguments, and they're far less exciting than time warps or ancient powers. But they're also the kind of debates that actually move understanding forward. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost soothing. In a few triangle cases, historians still debate the order of events rather than the cause. Not whether something supernatural happened, but whether navigation failed before weather worsened, or the other way around. It's a reminder that disagreement doesn't automatically mean mystery. It often just means complexity. You feel how different this tone is from the legend you started with. No ominous music, no sweeping claims, just careful language and conditional phrasing. Likely, possibly, based on available evidence. These words don't thrill, but they respect reality. They acknowledge that humans did their best to reconstruct events that unfolded quickly and far from witnesses. Historians still argue whether the Bermuda Triangle deserves any special status at all, or if it should be treated like countless other regions with heavy traffic and incomplete records. Some suggest the triangle is best understood as a cultural artifact rather than a geographical one. A story we tell about uncertainty, not a place where uncertainty behaves differently. You linger on that thought, letting it settle like a soft blanket. The debate isn't about monsters or forces. It's about humility, about admitting what we know, what we suspect, and what we'll probably never know in fine detail. That admission doesn't weaken history, it strengthens it. As you drift onward, the remaining questions feel smaller now, contained. They don't loom, they don't threaten. They simply exist like footnotes at the edge of the page. The triangle no longer demands belief. It invites quiet consideration and nothing more. The ocean continues its steady rhythm, unconcerned with our arguments. And in that steady indifference, there's comfort. Not every question needs a dramatic answer. Some can remain gently unresolved without turning into legends. And as the night deepens, those soft, scholarly debates fade into the background, leaving you with a sense of calm acceptance that feels far more sleep-friendly than fear ever could. You keep drifting, almost weightless now, as the story shifts away from charts and debates and settles into something closer to the mind itself. The Bermuda Triangle has mostly dissolved as a mystery, yet its grip lingers. That persistence isn't about evidence, it's about people, about how you and everyone else respond to uncertainty when it stretches out in front of you like open water at night. Humans are storytellers first, analysts second. A mainstream historical fact anchors this realization. Cognitive psychologists have long shown that the human brain prefers coherent narratives over random data. We're uncomfortable with coincidence. When events cluster, even by chance, we instinctively look for meaning. The triangle offered meaning where the ocean only offered probability. You imagine yourself hearing one disappearance story, then another, then a third. Your brain quietly connects them, even if they're separated by years and miles. Patterns feel reassuring. They suggest control. An explanation, even a frightening one, feels better than admitting that accidents can happen without reason or warning. Here's a quirky tidbit that fits this perfectly. Once a place gains a reputation, people start interpreting new events through that lens automatically. A storm becomes unusual. A delay becomes suspicious. The label changes perception before facts even enter the conversation. The triangle didn't just describe events, it shaped how they were remembered. Historians still argue whether myths like this thrive more during periods of rapid technological change. Some suggest that as ships and planes became more advanced, failures felt more shocking, more unacceptable. Mystery stepped in to soften that discomfort. If technology couldn't fail us, then something else must be at work. You feel how gentle this explanation is. It doesn't mock belief, it explains it. The triangle wasn't born from foolishness. It grew from very human instincts, fear of the unknown, love of narrative, and a deep need to feel oriented in a world that often is. That realization feels kind, not dismissive. As you drift onward, the story loosens its final knots. You don't need the triangle to be real to understand why it mattered. It served as a container for anxiety, a place where uncertainty could be stored and named. Once named, it felt manageable, even entertaining. The ocean beneath you remains vast, but it no longer feels threatening. It feels honest. Sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes we don't get clean answers. And sometimes we build stories not to deceive, but to cope. The night deepens, your breathing slows, and the last emotional charge drains from the myth. What remains is quiet understanding. The Bermuda Triangle fades not because it was proven false, but because you no longer need it to explain the world. And in that gentle release, sleep feels very close, very welcome. You keep drifting, slower than before, as if the ocean itself has decided there's no rush anymore. The last sharp edges of the Bermuda Triangle story have softened completely now. What once felt like a looming presence has settled into something ordinary and calm. You imagine looking out over the water one final time, expecting mystery and finding only movement. Steady, predictable, almost comforting. The triangle doesn't announce an ending. It simply runs out of tension. A mainstream historical fact rests quietly here. Modern navigation systems, satellites, GPS tracking, and constant communication have turned this entire region into one of the most closely monitored stretches of ocean and airspace on the planet. Ships don't slip away unnoticed. Planes don't vanish without records. When problems happen, they're investigated, logged, and explained with a level of detail that leaves very little room for legend. You feel the weight of that settle in. If the Bermuda Triangle were ever something more than a story, this is where it would have revealed itself. Instead, traffic continues uninterrupted. Weather behaves as forecasted. Compasses point where physics tells them to point. The ocean hasn't changed. Only the way we talk about it has. Here's a final quirky tidbit, offered gently. Modern mariners and pilots who regularly pass through this area often report being surprised when passengers ask about the triangle at all. To them, it's not a place of danger or mystery. It's just another route, another shift, another routine crossing logged and forgotten by morning. Historians still argue, in a quiet and almost philosophical way, whether the Bermuda Triangle should be remembered at all as a mystery or as a lesson, not about the sea, but about storytelling, about how easily fear can take shape when information is thin, and how stubborn that shape can be once it settles into culture. You remain here for a moment longer, letting that idea fade. The triangle doesn't collapse dramatically. It simply dissolves like fog warming under daylight. What's left behind is water, wind, and the steady passage of time, things that never needed myth to exist. As the journey comes to rest, the ocean feels vast but familiar. No curses, no secrets, just the same Atlantic that carried sailors, traders, pilots, and travelers long before anyone decided it needed a name. The mystery is solved not with a revelation, but with understanding. And understanding, unlike fear, doesn't keep you awake. The water keeps moving, the story grows quieter, and the night invites you to let go. Now everything slows. The ocean beneath you stretches endlessly, but it no longer asks anything from you. The waves don't rise in warning. They simply roll, one after another, patient and unbothered. The air feels softer here, like the world has exhaled along with you. There's nothing left to figure out, nothing left to explain. You're safe in the quiet understanding that not every dark patch on a map hides a secret. Some places are just places. Some stories grow loud only because we repeat them in the dark, when the mind is already halfway to dreaming. Your breathing evens out as the last echoes of the legend fade. The triangle no longer pulls at your attention. It drifts away, unneeded, leaving behind a calm, open sea and a sense of gentle closure. The kind that doesn't demand applause or conclusions, just rest. Imagine the lights dimming further now. The horizon blurs. The sound of water becomes a soft, constant hush, like static or distant rain. Thoughts loosen their grip. If any remain, they move slowly without urgency, dissolving before they can fully form. You don't have to stay alert anymore. There's nothing waiting to surprise you. No mystery hiding just out of sight. Only the steady rhythm of the world continuing, reliable and calm. Let your shoulders sink. Let your jaw unclench. Let the story slip away as sleep takes its place, gentle and unforced, like drifting farther out to sea where everything feels lighter. You've reached the quiet end of the journey. End of script, sweet dreams.